The House with a Clock in its Walls by John Bellairs, Chapter 6. The next morning, when Lewis came down to breakfast, Uncle Jonathan was reading an article on the front page of the New Zebedee Chronicle. Curious, Lewis leaned over his shoulder, and this is what he read. Tomb desecrated by vandals. Answers sought in senseless act. Last night, vandals broke into the old Izzard mausoleum in Oak Ridge Cemetery. The doors of the tomb were found standing ajar, with the padlock lying shattered on the pavement. This incident has sadly marred what was otherwise a Halloween remarkably free from incidents of vandalism and wanton destructiveness. What these human ghouls hoped to attain lies mercifully beyond conjecture, but it may be hoped. "Morning, Lewis," said Jonathan, without looking up. "Did you sleep well?" Lewis turned pale. Did Jonathan know? Mrs. Zimmerman was sitting across the table munching her Cheerios. "Does it say whether they disturbed the coffins?" she asked. "No, it doesn't," said Jonathan. "The caretaker probably just shoved the doors shut and fastened them with a new padlock. I don't blame him. I wouldn't want to look inside old Isaac Izzard's tomb." Lewis sat down. There were too many things whirling around in his head, and he was trying to get them straightened out. I was up in the cemetery with Tarby a couple of times, Uncle Jonathan," he said cautiously, "but I didn't see any tomb with Izzard on it." "Oh, well, he didn't want his name on the tomb. When he had it fixed up for his wife's body, he bought in a stone cutter who chiseled off the family name and carved an omega." "An omega?" said Lewis. "What's that?" "It's the last letter of the Greek alphabet, and it's used by a lot of wizards. It looks like an O, except that it's open at the bottom. It is the sign of the Last Judgment, the end of the world." Lewis sat there staring at the little O's floating in his bowl. He forced himself to eat a few of them. "How come he wanted something like that on his tomb?" asked Lewis. He was trying to conceal the tremble in his voice. "Lord knows, Lewis," said Jonathan. "Say, you're not scared about this tomb-breaking business, are you? Old Isaac Izzard's dead and gone. He's not going to bother us." Lewis looked at Jonathan. Then he looked at Mrs. Zimmerman. He knew, as well as he knew anything, that they couldn't wait for him to go off to school so they could discuss the matter alone. So he finished his breakfast, mumbled goodbye to them, grabbed up his books, and left. Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman did indeed want to discuss the break-in alone. Any tampering with the tomb of two powerful wizards like Isaac and Selina Izzard was a matter for serious discussion, and they didn't want to frighten Lewis with their talk, but they had no idea of what Lewis had done. Jonathan was not in the habit of peering in at the sleeping form of his nephew during the night, so he had no idea that Lewis had been out of the house. Of course, he and Mrs. Zimmerman had been concerned for some time about Lewis's strange behavior, but they did not connect it with what happened on Halloween night. After their discussion, which came to no conclusions at all, except that there was dirty work afoot, Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman decided that it would be nice to take Lewis on an evening ride around Capernaum County. They knew he loved to ride, and since they hadn't taken him out in some time, they thought that maybe an excursion would shake some of the gloom out of his system. But when Lewis came home from school that day, he was depressed and worried. He had been thinking about the tomb business all day long. So when Jonathan pushed back his chair after dinner and asked Lewis if he'd like to go for a nice long ride, Lewis merely shrugged his shoulders and said, "Yeah, I guess I'd like to go," in a dying cat sort of voice. Jonathan stared at Lewis for a minute, but he said nothing. He merely got up and went to get his car keys. Soon all three of them, Jonathan, Mrs. Zimmerman, and Lewis, were crammed into the front seat of Jonathan's 1935 Muggins Simoon, a big black car with running boards and a windshield that could be cracked open. The car, spewing clouds of bluish smoke, backed down the rutted driveway and into the street. They drove for hours as the afterglow of sunset stayed and stayed, and the hollows filled with purple mist. They drove past barns with big blue signs on their sides that said, "Chew Mail Pouch." They drove past green John Deere tractors parked in deep muddy ruts. Uphill and downhill they drove over bumpy railroad crossings with X-shaped signs that said "Rail, Sing, Cross, Road" if you read them the wrong way, through little towns that were no more than a church, a food store with a gas pump outside, and a flagpole on a triangle of green grass where the roads met. By the time it got dark, they were miles from New Zebedee. They were on their way home when, for no reason that Lewis could see, Jonathan stopped the car. He turned off the motor and sat there, staring at the row of green dashboard lights. "What's wrong, Uncle Jonathan?" asked Louis. "I keep imagining I hear a car somewhere," said Jonathan. "Do you hear it, Florence?" "Yes, I do," said Mrs. Zimmerman, giving him a puzzled look. "But what's so odd about that? They do let people drive these roads at night, you know." "Do they?" said Jonathan in a strange voice. He opened the car door and stepped out onto the gravel. "Stay here," he said to them, and he walked up the road a little ways and stood there, listening. Even with the car doors open, Louis could hear nothing but the wind in the roadside trees and the clattering of a tin sign on the barbed wire fence. The car was parked near the top of a high hill, and now Louis could see headlights rising out of a gully and then dipping into the next one. Jonathan came running back to the car. He slammed the door and started the motor. With a squealing of tires, he turned the car around and headed back the way they had come. Louis was frightened. "What's wrong, Uncle Jonathan?" he asked. "Ask me later, Louis. Florence, what's the best way, other way, back to New Zebedee?" "Take the next side road to your right. That's 12-Mile Road, and it runs into the Wilder Creek Road. And step on it, they're gaining." Many times when he had been out riding with his father and mother, Louis had pretended that they were being followed by some car or other. It was a good game to pass the time on long, dull evening rides, and he remembered how he had always felt disappointed when the mystery car turned away into a side street or a driveway. But tonight's game was for real. Around sharp curves they went, lurching dangerously far over the squealing of tires, up hills, down hills, then 70 or 80 miles an hour on the straightaway, which was never straight for long on these winding country roads. Louis had never seen Jonathan drive so fast or so recklessly, but no matter how fast he drove, the two cold circles of light still burned in his rearview mirror. Both Mrs. Zimmerman and Uncle Jonathan seemed to know who or what was in the car behind them, or at least they seemed to know that it was someone that had the power to do them harm, but they said as little as possible, except to confer now and then about directions. So Louis just sat there, trying to feel comforted by the green dashboard lights and the warm breath of the heater on his knees. Of course, he also felt comforted by the two wizards, whose warm, familiar bodies pressed against his in the furry darkness, but he knew that they were scared, and this made him twice as scared. What was after them? Why didn't Uncle Jonathan or Mrs. Zimmerman just wave an arm and turn the evil car into a wad of smoldering tinfoil? Louis stared up at the reflected headlights, and he thought of what he had seen in the cemetery, and of what Uncle Jonathan had told him about Mrs. Izzard's eyeglasses. He was beginning to have a theory about how all these things fitted together. The car raced on, spitting stones from under its tires, down into hollows bordered by dark skeletal trees, up over high hills, on and on while the setting moon settled to race to keep up with them. They covered a large part of Capernaum County that night, because the way around was a long way. After what seemed like hours of driving, they came to a place where three roads met. As the car screeched around a turn, Louis saw for a few seconds a Civil War cannon white with frost, a wooden church with smeary stained glass windows, and a general store with a glimmering window that said, "Salada." "We're on the Wilder Creek Road now, Louis." "We're on the Wilder Creek Road now, Louis," said Mrs. Zimmerman, as she put her arm around him. "It won't be long now. Don't be afraid." The car raced on. Dead roadside stalls, bent in its hot wind, and the overhanging branches whipped along the metal roof. The burning white holes danced in the mirror as before, and it looked like they were getting closer. They had never, since the start of the chase, been more than 2 or 3 car lengths away. Jonathan shoved the accelerator to the floor. The needle moved up to 80, which was dangerous to say the least on these roads. But the greater danger was behind, so Jonathan took the big roundhouse curves as well as he could, and the tires screeched, and the fenders almost touched the crumbling asphalt at the side of the road. This was blacktop, and you could go faster on it than you could on loose gravel. At last they came to the top of a high hill. There, below them, glimmering peacefully in the starlight, the moon had gone down some time ago, was Wilder Creek. There was the bridge, a maze of crisscrossing black girders. Down the hill they barreled, faster and faster. The car behind followed just as fast. They were almost to the bridge when the lights in the rearview mirror did something headlights had never done before. They grew and brightened till the reflection was a blinding bar of white light Lewis clapped his hands to his eyes. Had he been struck blind? Had Jonathan been blinded too? Would the car crash, or... Suddenly, Lewis heard the rolling clatter of the bridge under the car. He took his hands away from his face. He could see Jonathan was smiling and putting on the brakes. Mrs. Zimmerman heaved a deep sigh of relief. They were across the bridge. As Jonathan opened the door to get out, Lewis twisted around in his seat and saw that the other car had stopped just before it got to the bridge. Its headlights were dark now, except for two smoldering yellow pinpoints. Lewis could not tell if there was anyone in the car, because the windshield was covered by a blank silvery sheen. Jonathan stood there, his hands on his hips, watching. He did not seem afraid of the other car now. Slowly the mysterious car turned around and drove away. When Jonathan got back to the Muggin saloon, he was chuckling. "It's all over, Lewis. Relax. Witches and other evil things can't cross running water. It's an old rule, but it still applies." "You might throw in the fact," said Mrs. Zimmerman, in her most pedantic tone, "that Elihu Clabernog built that iron bridge in 1892. He was supposed to be doing it for the county, but he was really doing it to try to make sure that the ghost of his dead uncle, Jedediah, didn't cross the stream to get him. Now, Elihu was a part-time warlock, and what he put into that iron of the bridge—" "Oh, good heavens!" cried Jonathan, covering his ears. "Are you going to go through the whole history of Capernaum County at 4 a.m.? "Is it that late? Asked Lewis. "That late or later," said Jonathan wearily. "It's been quite a ride." They drove on toward New Zebedee. On the way, they stopped at an all-night diner and had a large breakfast of waffles, eggs, American fries, sausage, coffee, and milk. Then they sat around for a long time talking about the narrow escape they had had. Lewis asked a lot of questions, but he didn't get many answers. When they got back to New Zebedee, it was dawn. Dawn of an overcast November day. The town and its hills appeared to be swimming in a gray, grainy murk. When Jonathan pulled up in front of the house, he said, "There's something wrong, Florence. Stay in the car with Lewis." "Oh, dear," she cried, wrinkling up her mouth. "What more can happen?" Jonathan swung back the iron gate and marched up the walk. From where he was sitting, Lewis could see that the front door was open. This could easily be explained, since people in New Zebedee never locked their doors, and sometimes the latches didn't hold when they closed them. Jonathan disappeared in the house, and he didn't come back for 10 full minutes. When he did reappear, he looked worried. "Come on, Florence," he said, opening the door on her side. "It's safe to go in, I think, but the house has been broken into." Lewis burst into tears. "They didn't steal your water pipe, did they? Or the Bon Sewer coins?" Jonathan smiled weakly. "No, Lewis, I'm afraid it's not as simple as all that. Someone was looking for something, and I think they found it. Come on in." Lewis expected to find the house in wild disorder, with chairs and lamps smashed and things all scattered around. But when he got to the front hall, he found everything in order. At least that's the way it looked. Jonathan tapped him on the shoulder and pointed toward the ceiling. "Look up there," he said. Lewis gasped. The brass cup that covered the place where the ceiling fixture met the ceiling had been pried loose. It dangled halfway down the chain. "It's like that all over the house," said Jonathan. "Every wall sconce and ceiling light has had its cup jimmied loose. And a few chairs were overturned, and a couple of vases were broken, just to make it look like this was an ordinary break-in. But we ought not be fooled. Whoever it was had a general idea of where to look. Come here." Jonathan led Lewis and Mrs. Zimmerman into the front parlor, a more or less unused room full of fussy little red velvet chairs and settees. On the wall over the parlor organ was a brass light fixture like all the others in the house, a tarnished, cup-shaped thing fitted to the wall, and a crooked little brass tube sticking out of it. On the end of the tube was a socket and a bulb with a frilly pink shade. "I thought you said the cup was loose," said Lewis, and we'll pause there.